Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
Good morning, everybody. I decided to have a little band ensemble here to guide us through today's show. Oh, it's going to be hot. Can you hear that? Well, good morning once again. Welcome to Brand Live Radio. I'm Mitch Mortian, and today on my show, A Twist in the Yarn, we are discussing quite a vehement topic recently. And the topic is entitled The Rise of Ladies' Vintage Fashion. Now, a big question that comes up is why are old things increasingly popular with younger people? Old school vinyl, calligraphy, and vintage are but three of a handful of trends that have little place in the tech age, but are enjoying a resurgence nonetheless. The trend for vintage fashion may be considered a response to the negative publicity and effects of fast fashion. Fast fashion is essentially a business model for companies that manufacture products to retail in their own high street, making use of vertical integrated product methods. And the fast fashion method ensures quick response to consumers that demand things on time. Yes, gang, that's a beautiful track. It's called La Vie en Rose by the equally famous Grace Jones. Now, this was a track originally written way back in 1947 by Edith Piaf and Marie Monod. Beautiful track. Essentially, it means looking through rose-colored sunglasses at the world. Yes, so I was essentially talking about the fast fashion versus now the vintage fashion. So we now have a did you know moment. Did you know that as of the late 2012-2013, the UK consumers disposed of more than 2 tons of fast fashion clothing that only had been worn for around 6 times on average? Meanwhile, the vintage trend gained a slow but steady growth, preserving and recycling fashion products that are representative of past trends from different eras. So, whilst vintage, like fast fashion, can be traced back to the 1990s, more recently, vintage has emerged as a much stronger fashion trend, and the movement is showing potential to increase further as consumers adopt new attitudes towards, now this is the term I like to use at my store, they adopt new attitudes towards pre-loved clothing. Now, also from around 2009, when we had the huge global recession, the global recession meant also that everything had to slow down. And then when people are affected by this in terms of retail, they then focus on things of value, and more people are turning towards purchasing of pre-loved clothing. Vintage has now shifted from subculture to mass culture. And I think a lot of the disappointment is with the fact that with the exclusive clothing at high street shops, regardless of price and fashion, you're not getting the exclusivity or the individuality you require. The rise of vintage, as John Walsh very aptly put it in his article in The Independent, is that vintage is about looking forward through the window of the past. I love that. That's an oxymoron, right? Looking forward through the window of the past. Nostalgia seems to have a vital role in vintage consumption, as vintage garments have the ability to represent past eras as stories are interweaved within the garments. The popularity of vintage clothing has risen during recent years as a yearning for familiarity in a society that is constantly changing with technological advancements. And we're becoming more fast-paced. However, we're becoming more detached than before. So, vintage fashion can be seen as a form of stability against a rapidly changing environment, which helps consumers to reconnect with the time gone by where things were simpler. And you hear this now and again, the bygone era, the golden age, and so forth. So now let's look at some significant factors that have risen or contributed to the rise of vintage. With the effect of the recession on consumers, especially on the finances, many have been seen to opt down or trade down or even shop at charity shops, which may be viewed as a factor in the rise of vintage fashion. Celia Walden, in her Telegraph article, points out that the impact of the recession has on current fashion trends, stated that the sociological behind the midi skirt isn't quite so subtle. Uncertain times have provoked a nostalgia for the safer values of yesteryear. And the article continues with her saying, we're in between skirt lengths. I like that. Because we're in between austerity and prosperity. Now, on the austerity aspect, you may recall around the global recession from around 2009, thereabouts, there were austerity measures in Europe, especially in Greece with the fall of the Greek economy. And then more recently, from about 2012, we've had the issue of Brexit. So these austerity measures in terms of the financial constraints actually put in a change or an opportunity for vintage. So austerity in the vintage industry brought on a certain prosperity. Now, another factor is that there is also a return to post-war mentality as a vintage consumer. They like to repair, reuse, and recycle. Now, I just want to take you quick back. Do you recall from the podcast 1 where I spoke about the 4 R's? And the 4 R's within the timeless clothier's creed is basically recycle, respect, rands and cents, and reuse. So we have a good throwback in terms of people wanting the old values of the post-war. We will take a short break now, and when we come back, we look at the further issues of fashion trends and how designers are impacted by vintage clothing.
Have you ever thought about the power of social media? Social media has the power to make your business grow. Grow! Yeah. Why don't you let us manage your social media? Because our business is to see your business grow. Visit us at www.bstownmedia.co.za.
Hey Bonang, how are you?
Hi Tuli, look so beautiful. Hey, long time no see. What happened to your skin, by the way? The last time I saw you, you had a lot of blemishes and breakouts. It was so terrible, man.
Wow, thanks for that, Benang. Luckily, I discovered DMK. Have you heard of DMK?
DMK? Who are they?
DMK is a paramedical skincare brand that specializes in all skin conditions. Would you like their number?
Yes, please.
I know you're not good at numbers, so let me give you their website address because your skin looks terrible. It's www.dmkskincare.co.za.
Have you
You're listening to brandlive.co.za.
Looking out on the morning rain, I used to feel so uninspired. And when I knew I had to face another day, Lord, it made me feel so tired. Before the day I met you, life was so unkind. And you're the key to my peace of mind. 'Cause you make me feel, you make me feel, you make me feel like a natural woman. When my soul was in the lost and found, you came along to claim it. I didn't know just what was wrong with me till your kiss helped me name it. Now I'm no longer doubtful of what I'm living for. And if I make you happy, I don't need to do more. 'Cause you make me feel, you make me feel, you make me feel like a natural woman.
Oh, I had to pay tribute to the Queen of Soul, Aretha Franklin, and she puts it very nicely when she whispers, "You make me feel like a natural woman." Of course, that song was originally written by the great Carole King and Jerry Goffin. Now, if you pace through all your old Motown and the older LPs, you'll see the Jerry Goffin and Carole King collaboration. This is way back in 1967. At any rate, I last stopped when we spoke about the fashion trends and the designers. Now, yes, everybody is opportunistic. Designers also take inspiration from vintage clothing to produce your current collections. And as Little Red Vintage interviewee states, that all fashion trends are recycled. They come from vintage styles. That's what you need to be aware of. So we're now looking at, just to repeat, what were the factors attributing to the rise of ladies' vintage. So we've been through the aspect of the post-war blues. You're looking at the fashion trends. Now let's look at something that really impacts you personally. And I'm talking about style, quality, and individuality. Methinks that vintage consumers are trying to escape from this trend and create individual identities for themselves by wearing something that's unique, that is one of a kind. I mean, quite often I get a terrific spectrum of clientele coming through. Students from UJ, I get the local celebrities from the Auckland Park, and then I get a fair share of tourists. Now, all of a different age spectrum. But mind you, everybody wants to have that something special, that uniqueness. So, that is something that if you're out there and you really want to have your own trending little store, your vintage store, or whatever it is, remember, uniqueness is your key. And I think with regards to vintage, the consumers now are turning away from mass manufactured garments. They really want to have something that is personal, which is a better style and quality, something that you'll find the likes of on high street, but at a more reduced price. Now, with vintage fashion, it allows the consumers to mix in certain elements. Now, I like to use this little discussion here as to subtitle, Be Your Own Designer. So whilst you're having this mix in elements of the past with contemporary clothing to create new ideas, it also suggests that vintage clothing or vintage fashion allows the customer to become their own designer, alter the styles, and have that ability that an outfit that may not necessarily be trendy and someone else could well work with you, because remember, vintage or any type of clothing works with your personality. Now, the Palmer and Clark researchers that helped with this article, they also suggested that consumers identify that a symbol of fashion independence is what they are wanting from this humdrum of technology where everything is mass produced and everything is so detached. Now, moving on to the next factor in terms of the growth of ladies vintage, let's look at the eco-sustainability. Now, if you recall from the podcast one, I did spend a fair share of time talking about the eco-friendliness of and recycling of vintage clothing. So vintage fashion can also be viewed as a part of consumer interest in ethical clothing, as it's considered a form of recycling and reusing fashion. One good thing is that we now have quite a few celebrities that are, becoming aware and making it known that they prefer to wear vintage. Now, by so doing, they also helping to improve the image of vintage fashion. And in the past, wearing previously worn garments was frowned upon by the fashion community, and the pre-loved culture was seen as something that only people with lower income would buy into it as a form of necessity rather than desire. Well, now we're having the desire first, the necessity second, and it is not in any way something that people should shy away from, whether it is high income or low income. The point is, as Renee Zellweger and Reese Witherspoon also mentioned, that they encourage the various fashion, vintage fashions, and they encourage it by wearing such attire to red carpet events. And even the likes of the British singer Lily Allen, she apparently has quit the music scene and she's now launching her own fashion label, and which is called Lucy in Disguise. Celebrities are collaborating with retailers, and they now want to produce their new vintage lines, which are heavily influenced by vintage styles, but are newly produced. We shall now go for another ad break, and when we come back, we'll then look at the last remaining contributing factors, go into the conclusion, and of course, spin you a terrific tune.
It's the official Major World Online Stu Invasion.
Bars on bars.
What about me right now? It's about our guest, Bafetti skip on. I'm out in Matalele, Bafetti. I'm a playing in studio, Bafetti, skip on. Oh, Fustanyana. Shang Fustan. Fanukuma no Baba Andy.
Hashtag.
I think it's a lot of beat, dog. No good.
Young niggas' ambition, waking up is working for money. Changing their past, feeding their fams, malang lali. We keep it running like SPV, exchanging money.
Man, nice. Hey, hey, call them unexpected experts. White sweatshirt.
Hey.
Looking down on these niggas, my damn neck hurts.
Woo.
You can go ahead, homie, give me your best work. I bet you take your phone out and mumble up your first words.
Live from 27 boxes in the heart of Melville. This is brandlive.co.za.
In the joint, I could see you were a man of distinction, real deep pockets, good looking and so fine. Wouldn't you like to know what's going on in my mind? So let me get right to the point. I'll pop my coat for every guy I see. Hey, big spender, a little time with me. Come on. Would you like to have fun? How's about a few laughs? I can show you a good time. I can show you a good time. The minute you walked in this joint, I could see you were a man of distinction.
Hey, Big Spender. Oh, this was one of my favorite tunes. Originally, it's written by Cy Coleman and Dorothy Fields, and exquisitely performed by the sultry Shaka Khan. Do you know that she can hit one of those C's that can shatter your champagne glass as she does her R&B route? Whoa, she is really multi-skilled. So, on with the show. We're now onto the aspect of a further aspect of what influences the rise, and this is, I think, the key to everything. And this factor is called the media. The media impacts the rise of vintage fashion, as it's regularly featured within pages of leading fashion magazine, lifestyle magazine, and is promoted as a sign of individuality and connoisseurship. Now, the Little Red Vintage interview supports this, disclosing that the store that was recently interviewed for a feature in Marie Claire magazine was one of the new retail vintage stores set up in the area. So people, like celebrities, film, television, fashion catwalks, whomever, at some point they are focusing on vintage fashion, which has raised the profile of this trend. Film and television, like the arts and culture, have long since been used as sources of design inspiration by designers. Now, we have alluded to this a bit earlier, but similarly, popular television programs are a source of inspiration for consumers. The one that people speak much of, especially in the UK, is the series Mad Men, which was set out in the 1960s and essentially portrays the fictional lives of people involved in the advertising industry. Now, the internet has dramatically increased the awareness and the popularity of the vintage fashion, making it accessible to a wider audience. Now, websites such as your eBay, etc., are helping everyday consumers to buy into the vintage trend by making it more accessible and affordable, as vintage prices are placed on auction sites. Social networking, such as your Facebook and Twitter, are also increasingly the availability of vintage fashion. Well, I may dare say, since I'm now hosting the show, that I've had a fair share of hits on the local Twitter scene, on the local Facebook and Instagram, especially with my store, Timeless Clothiers. So if you also wish to have a look at certain items that we are discussing and you would like to avail yourself to it, hit me up on Twitter or on Instagram or on WhatsApp. if the items aren't available, please make a recommendation so I can go out and perchance look for something for yourselves. So to get on to things and to close it now, we're just looking at a further point which reviews what was the attraction of vintage. What were the factors, what were the multiple reasons for the boost in vintage? So there were about 925 respondees, and of that, the most popular attraction to the vintage trend is styling. I think that speaks volumes, because styling is linked to your individuality. The next item that came upon was the quality. The quality of vintage items is unsurpassed, and that was followed by one of a kind and lifestyle, and of course value for money. So in conclusion, this is the abstract of the rise of the vintage fashion. So amongst other factors, the current economic climate appears to have contributed to the trend of acquiring and reusing vintage clothing, accessories, and homeware products, particularly with the younger consumers. The popularity of vintage has also been linked to a change in consumer attitudes towards wearing and utilizing pre-loved goods. Well, there we are, gang. Another show and yet another end of the show. Thank you so much for joining us. And remember, as mentioned earlier, should you have any ideas you'd like to discuss, do hit me up on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, or on WhatsApp on 062 043 2802. Adios, amigos.
Live from 27 Boxes in the heart of Melville, this is brandlive.co.za.